Chapter 12. The market district was a rather bustling place. Perhaps not the most surprising of things, considering it was just after the noon hour, and the weather was nice today. Duran looked around like a tourist, which Liska supposed was true enough. She hadn't expected it to have gone so well between her parents and Duran. Well, between her mother and Duran, that was. Her father. Her father's entire plan had hinged on marrying her off, though her mother had seemed to have taken a liking to the Wilderlander. That was another thing. For a person who had apparently grown up in the woodlands without a mother, raised by only his father, Duran was quite well-mannered, if a little forceful and blunt. She snorted at her own line of thinking. After all, Duran was much more than just a little forceful. He was like a goddess-damn stormfront, just rolling in whenever he wanted, and over whatever he wanted. The fact that he could be a proper gentleman, clearly shown by his knowledge of dueling protocol, as well as his refinement at the meal with her parents, just highlighted all the other times he was painfully direct. It was an odd dichotomy, but one that seemed to be at the core of her betrothed's personality, and as such it would be something she would have to learn to get used to. Despite her father's insistence that he was going to cancel the betrothal, Liska found herself doubting he would be able to. For the first time in memory, her father might have found a challenge that his vast amount of money and stubborn pride could not overcome. The thought of such a circumstance caused a spike of guilty pleasure that went down her spine and made her tail curl. "So, where is the best place to go?" Duran asks. Liska blinked once or twice, clearing the image of her father's pain and suffering out of her mind before answering. "Well, there is Master Smith Lufris's forge. He is the best smith in all of Kidala. He and his apprentices do everything from mastercraft swords to armor and even jewelry," she said. Watching as his eyes lit up in the mention of mastercraft swords, it was no surprise that that was what had caught his attention. "Is that where you got your blade?" he asked. "No," she said, shaking her head at him. "It is a family heirloom. It has been passed down for generations. My great-grandsire acquired it on campaign against the Bayesian kingdom in the Fourth Era. We had never been able to find information as to who made it." She pulled the blade out of the sheath about an inch or so, showing Duran the maker's mark. He leaned down to get a closer look at it, and then straightened back up to give her a bright smile. "Well, allow me to dispel the mystery," he said, partially drawing his own blade and showing her the maker's mark on it. "The old man got this blade forged for him at the Mastersmith Jura of Tiberas. Likely it wasn't forged by him, seeing as your grandsire would have lived, about 100 or so years ago? But I'm willing to bet that it was forged by Jor's grandsire. The Tiberasian people pass down their crest from father to son, so long as the son continues the father's craft." Liska opened and closed her mouth a few times. She, of course, knew about the Tiberasian smiths. They were legendary, both in their craftsmanship of armors and weapons. Rumour had it that the legendary swordmaster Holviti of Utan had a sword made in Tiberas. "You know where Tiberas is?" she asked, the question sticking in her throat. After all, it was hidden deep in the Molheim mountain ranges, in a place that few would ever dare to travel for fear of the beasts that stalked the lands. "What?" he asked, an eyebrow raised. No idea where it was. Remember, I lived my whole life in the woodlands. I said the old man went there, not me," he said with a laugh, sliding his blade back in the sheath. "Never asked him where it was." He shrugged and then went on looking at all the things in the market district around them. She was about to ask him a million follow-up questions, but before she could, he darted off in a different direction, something apparently catching his eye. When she and Michaeline caught up to him, he was standing in front of a puppeteer performing a play for children, who stopped and watched as he skillfully caused the two marionettes to dance together on the painted stage. Sighing with renewed annoyance, Liska grabbed Duran by his arm and steered him away from the display that had so captivated him, and back onto the main market street. "Come on," she said, completely forgetting what she had been about to ask him. "We're here for betrothal gifts, not puppet shows," she hissed, as she marched him towards the smithy, annoyed he would be distracted by something like that when they had come for something so important. Master Lufris's forge was a rather busy place, what with the 6 or so apprentices running around forging the more common items. Lufris himself didn't actually do much of the common forging anymore, opting instead to forge when a piece was commissioned from him, or if he simply felt the call of the fire and hammer. Rather, he sat in the shop area of the forge that was located to the side, proudly displaying his best pieces for people to ogle at. On the walls hung swords of every make and size, one-handed, hand and a half, and two-handed, both of the standard greatsword sized as well as monstrosities of steel that could barely be called swords. Rather, they had more in common with giant hulks of metal with a sharpened edge. Clearly they were decorative in nature, as there was no man in existence that could have ever swung one more than a few times consecutively. Even then, it would be more like dropping the blade and letting gravity do the work than swinging it. They had to weigh somewhere near 25 or 30 pounds, putting them well above the standard 5 or 6 of a traditional two-handed greatsword would weigh. Standing in racks were polearms of every make and model, from glaives to spears and even a spetum or two. Liska had to practically drag Durin past the weapons and up to the counter, behind which Master Lufris stood. He was a tall man, thick of shoulder, neck and arm. The light blue short-sleeved tunic he had on stretched tight over his frame, and looked like if he so much as flexed even slightly, it would rip at a seam. Over this he wore a scarred and stained, heavy leather apron, marked with the scars of years of work at a forge. On his massive hands were a pair of matching leather gloves, and as Liska and Durin approached him, he crossed his arms over his barrel of a chest and smiled down at her. Liska had always liked Lufris. He was a kindly man. His size, added with his shaven head and long bush black beard that reached mid-sternum, gave him an intimidating air, but in actuality he was a rather gentle giant, always happy to smile and forgive any wrongs against him, which made him the mirrored opposite of his wife. As they approached, he smiled down at Liska, and she smiled back up at him, forcefully dragging Durin up to the counter alongside her. "Liska!" the giant said, his voice exactly the baritone his size would imply would be, the smile on his lips wide and welcoming. "I have been hearing the most interesting rumours about you this morning." He raised an eyebrow and glanced over at Durin, his head cocked to the side like a big adorable puppy looking at something he was attempting to take in fully. "Is this?" He let the question stand, and Liska, knowing full well that her cheeks were currently darkening with the blush, nodded. "This is my betrothed, Durin of the Wilderlands," she said, by way of introduction. Durin reached his hand out to the old man, and the two of them grasped forearms, giving each other a firm shake, each regarding the other for a moment longer than would be friendly. But as they let go, they both had slight smiles on their lips. "That is quite the grip you had there, lad," Lufris said, with a note of approval in his voice. "Likewise," Durin said back to him, giving him a nod in return. Liska had always envied men that. They always simply nodded to each other, the motion clearly more than a simple greeting. It was almost like the nod and returning nod was its own unspoken language between men. She could only wonder at what the nod meant as it passed between the two of them. "So," Lufris said, once again resuming his standard arms crossed over, barrel-chest posture. "I assume that you came to me for tacits?" he asked, smiling as Liska blushed. She hated that. She had always hated the blushing maidens, the way they acted and the stereotypes they made, and yet here she was blushing just like them. She raised her head, cheeks on fire, but she forced herself to meet Lufris's gaze and nodded. "Good, good. What is the price range you are looking for?" he asked, leaning forward and smiling more. Durin simply held out his wrist, jingling the golden tigs laced on his wrist, allowing the play of the light and the sound of coin hitting coin do the talking for him. That was such a flamboyant gesture, but somehow it fit Durin. She had seen people tie tigs on clothing, or wear it like jewellery, but she'd only seen the very rich do so, and only when they had their bodyguards around to make sure there wasn't someone who would simply snatch the coins from them. It had a casual arrogance to it, almost like he was challenging someone to attempt to take the money from him. It occurred to her that perhaps he was, after all, his words to her father about the thing he loved the most being a challenge might have been a clever rebuttal, but at the same time, it also had the ring of truth to it. "I shall bring my finest then," Lufris said, a last smile on his face, at the thought of lightening Durin's load, one tig at a time. He knelt down and reached under the counter, grabbing something. Standing back up, he unrolled a black velvet cloth across the counter, before turning and walking back further in the shop, behind the counter, where no one but himself and his apprentices were ever allowed to go. He returned with several items which he laid on the cloth. There were 4 matching sets of tassets, each in different styles. There were larger, bulkier pieces of armour that were layered rectangles, riveted with either silver studs or copper, some lined with elegant filigree or vinework. All of them were crafted from silver, signifying purity of intention and purpose, and polished to a nearly mirrored shine. Liska found herself leaning over them, captivated by the beauty of each and every one of them. "I like this one," Durin said, pointing, and she pulled her eyes away from the piece she was currently staring at, and looked over at the one he had indicated. Of all the tassets, it was the simplest, made from a single sheet of silver. It had no rivets, no gold filigree or designs, simply an elongated hexagon, narrow at the base, and tall from the flat side to the peak. She was about to criticize his choice when he went on. "This one feels like Liska," he said, with a demeanour that was all seriousness. "It's elegant, refined, and feels like it has a purpose." He shrugged, looking down at it with a look of concentration. Liska looked at it again, and as she did, his words played over and over in her head. As she looked at it, it seemed to morph in front of her very eyes. Where she had seen simplicity, she now saw something else, something efficient and beautiful because of that. She glanced at the others, and what had once looked gorgeous to her now looked ostentatious and gaudy. "I like that one too," she said softly, wondering at what point in all of this her cheeks would burst into flames.
"Excellent choice," Lufris said, with an approving nod. "A very fine piece. Shall I go get its partner?"
he asked, and Durin nodded, untying the loop around his wrist as Lufris went back to retrieve the other tasset. When he returned, he accepted only one tick from Durin, and handed them over. Before she could say anything, Durin knelt down and started fastening the tasset onto her belt, adjusting the straps to let it rest comfortably on her hip. He was about to do the same to his own tasset when Liska grabbed it from his hand, and did the same to him, looking up as she finished, surprised by the heat in his eyes. Or at least she was surprised, up until she realized she was kneeling in front of him, her head at about waist level. She might have never taken part in any of the goings-on between men and women, but that didn't mean she was oblivious of what they were. Solvi had not been sparse on the details. The thought of Solvi brought a pang of guilt to her. After all, her best friend had been hurt in the Cyclops attack, might have even gotten killed like Corinth had, if Durin had not stepped in when he did, and she had not even gone to go see her. She resolved to bring up the issue with Durin as she stood up, stubbornly focusing on that instead of the heat that she had seen in Durin's eyes, and the answering wave she had felt deep in her stomach.
"Aha, Michaeline! It is good of you to come with,"
Lufris said, as she took the out granted to her, and gladly turned towards the man, hoping no one else had noticed what had flashed between her and her betrothed.
"I heard news of Corinth goddess, rest his soul, and Solvi. Pray tell me, how is the poor lass doing?"
Michaeline stepped forward, a grim look on his face, as he began recounting the events of the Cyclopean encounter. Liska had heard it from him before, but she still stepped forward, listening intently. Michaeline was halfway through the story when she heard a sharp, crystalline sound that made the muscles of her shoulders tense up. Closing her eyes tight, she reached to her right, her fears confirmed, when she felt nothing but thin air where Durin had been standing not moments ago. Turning around slowly, she saw him holding an elegant-looking one-handed blade with a bronze half-crescent crossguard and a fluted scent-stopper pommel, and groaned internally when she recognized it as Lufris's masterwork. It was the single most expensive sword in the entire shop, and the blade, which had been about 4.5 hands long, was now a good 3.5 hands shorter than it had been before Durin had touched it. "That's what I thought," he said, shaking his head and looking at the broken end of the sword. "Improper heat treatment and a small imperfection in the folding. It led to a fatal weakness in the blade's structure when I stressed it." He sighed. "It's a shame, as it was such a good-looking blade, but clearly this one was made by one of your apprentices," he said, looking up at Lufris, whose entire face had gone flat and pale, in a way that set off all the danger alarms in Liska's mind. A master craftsman would have never done something with such shoddy quality. "Out." The words came out strangled from Lufris's throat, like a man being choked to death, croaking his last. "What?" Durin asked, a baffled look on his face.
"Out!"
Lufris roared, his face flushing red with rage, and his whole body shaking with the sheer force of his anger.
"Out!"
Neither Liska nor Michaeline needed to be told a third time. They both scrambled out of the shop, each taking Durin by an arm, and fleeing before the bear of a man decided he wanted them to stay and feel his wrath, rather than to simply just hear it.